This is the second of two parts on writing summaries. I'm going to take you through some steps in that process now, using an example that comes from our textbook, the James Surowiecki piece in the New Yorker. If you don't know who this person is, this is a man named St. Jerome, who was the first person to translate the Bible from Greek into Latin. And it became the standard text for the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, that we use today. He's almost always depicted in what's called a scriptorium, and sometimes you'll see him with a lion at his feet. And there's a long story about that maybe if we spend some more time in the course, we'll learn about why there's a lion and St. Jerome usually in the same picture. Okay, there's basically two different ways that we can write summaries. One's called a does-says method, and you'll see that described on pages 28.7 through 28 in Writing Arguments. Another is what's called a key point summary that's similar but a slightly modified version of the does-says. You'll find a handout on Blackboard for that, and of course you can develop your own. Expect to read your source at least 4 times before you begin to write your summary. You'll find that the academic journal article that I've assigned for the summary piece for this particular assignment is in fact a long one that's going to require a fair amount of attention on your part. The does-says approach, the first thing you do is read it once through for general meeting and then read it again and again slowly, writing down does and says sentences for each paragraph. Like you might have one that says introduction is the does, and then the says sentences for that says here's what the introduction says. You try to capture the major points and subpoints, and this is where the subheadings in an argument become really important. If you notice, the academic journal article that we're working with has a number of subheadings that tells you pretty much what part of the article does what. So please pay attention to that as you go through. In fact, you can use those subheads and make like a little outline and just see what the components are for this particular argument before you start the does-says approach if you want to. And then after you write down one sentence of does and one sentence of says for each paragraph, you can then look at those and see if you can assemble that into one single prose summary. And then you revise until it's complete, until it's short enough, until it reflects the article accurately. And make sure that you use attributive tags, that is, the author says, or mention the names of the authors, and then a verb, and then whatever else you need to account for that particular piece of the source. The key points approach is similar but a little bit different. Here you read it through like we always do with the source, straight through, and you look particularly at the introduction and conclusion, and this will normally give you what the two major aspects of the article about, what it's about in the introduction and what it concludes at the end. And then reread as you go through, and this is where you really want to spend some more time looking at subheadings, the visuals, if there's any graphs or charts in there. Look for things that are in boldface. Look for things that are kind of like set up like a mini outline. This is very similar to the does-says approach, but here you're focusing a lot on the organization. You can go through with a highlighter if you want and figure out what the important sentences are. Those are normally going to be at the beginning and the end of a paragraph. And then you might want to look inside each paragraph for particular examples and data points to help you make your case. Once you highlight those, then you paraphrase each sentence in turn. Then I showed you a little bit about paraphrasing. In the last one, I'll talk some more about it in this video as well. And then figure out how you're going to organize this thing. Follow the organization of the article as a whole. If you remember from the previous video, I talked about retaining the emphasis, and that's what you want to do here. If an article spends 2/3 of its space describing the research process that the writers went through to create this particular study, for example, then that's what about 2/3 of your summary should include as well. Last steps. Again, you're going to be following an essay writing process. You're going to pre-write something. It's going to be a jumbled series of mess, like most pre-writing is. Then you're going to create a draft, and that's going to be probably a little bit less of a mess, but it's still going to be a mess. And then you're going to revise that draft repeatedly, and then at the very end of it, you're going to edit and proofread. Okay. Compare the final draft with your original article that you're summarizing to make sure you've been fair and comprehensive. And this may not be as easy as it sounds. This may take you 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 tries to get it until you're happy with it. Okay. Just some quick examples here. And by the way, the paintings I'm using, except for the one of St. Jerome, are all Vermeer paintings. This one's called Man Writing. Okay, here's a paragraph from the Surowiecki essay that's in our textbook on pages 25 through 27. You can read it just as well as I can. The issue here that they're talking about is what's kind of the status of this issue of what should we be paying people? Should we increase the minimum wage? Should we do something else? What's the problem? And then it offers information on how the writer knows that this issue is in fact a real issue, that it's not as simple as, oh, it's just teenagers working at fast food jobs, so we don't need to pay them very much. That in fact large numbers of people who are adults are in fact attempting to make a living and support families on the minimum wage. So here's a summary, and I wrote this relatively quickly after I read the paragraph 4 or 5 times. Surowiecki argues that many heads of households in the U.S. are trapped into jobs that were traditionally done by teenagers or underemployed women, fast food and retail. He points out that the slow growth of traditional middle-class jobs has stuck these people in place, trying to support families on part-time work. He claims 46% of family income now comes from low-wage work. So that's 65 words. Let me see if I can get this even shorter. I started off with 220, I'm down to 65, so I'm pretty close to that 25% mark. Let's see if I can get it shorter. Surowiecki argues that many heads of households in the U.S. are trying to support families on part-time work because of the slow growth of traditional middle-class jobs. Low-wage work traditionally done by teenagers or underemployed women like fast food and retail now provide 46% of family income. So you can see how I moved from 220 to 65 to now 51, so I'm getting better. And if I tackled this thing in even more detail, I might get even closer. But you can see how you can make something shorter but still retain the original point of it. You can also see that there are words like women or teenagers, middle class, things like that, part-time. These are words that we don't need to put in quotation marks because there really aren't any synonyms for these kinds of words. So we don't need to worry about putting those things into quotation marks. Okay. How do we paraphrase? And again, this is taking somebody else's words and turning it into a sentence of your own. And I have a couple of suggestions here for how to do this. Here's the original sentence that comes from Surowiecki, as a historian Bethany Morton has shown. Walmart in its early days sought explicitly to hire underemployed married women. And so I turned this around and turned it into my own words. Women willing to work part-time were specifically sought by Walmart when it first began. And here I've indicated that it's quoted from Moreton, and it's in Surowiecki's article. And you can see I've gotten it to 14 words from 19 words. Okay. You reverse the order, use your own words. I use the synonym feature or the thesaurus feature in Microsoft Word a great deal. And then I use a real dictionary to make sure that I'm using a word that is appropriate as a synonym. And then the documentation system here does some of the work. It tells me who said it, and it tells me where I can find it. So that helps me reduce the number of words I need in the summary. Don't worry about trying to get this right the first time. This is something that you're going to get better at as the course goes on. I'm just expecting you to do your best. That's all I'm looking for here. Here's what an MLA works cited page entry would look like. And you can tell this is where I got it from. It came from the book Writing Arguments, although it's originally published in New Yorker. So this gives you an idea of what documentation you would need for if you were doing this. In your summary assignment, it asks you for a citation if you can do it, but I'm just looking for an attempt. I'm not looking for you to get this right the first time out of the box. Thank you very much.